Hello to all our tribesters and our extended tribe. This is Conscious Leaders, a series about leaders who are doing things differently and winning. Joining me today is Eleanor Mills. Els is one of the bigger names in UK media for the past few decades. She rose through the ranks of the Sunday Times to Editorial Director. And having run teams and strategies for one of the UK's leading papers, she's more than qualified to talk about leadership, the role of women, and highlight some really valuable insights on women in midlife. She is now the founder and editor-in-chief of Noon, an online media platform that empowers women in midlife. And it's really looking to change the narrative around the later stages of women's lives. Els, it's so great to have you with me. Thanks for joining.
Hi, really nice to be with you.
Let's start with your journey. So did you always want to be a journalist, and how did your career unfold?
Did I always want to be a journalist? I think so. My dad always used to accuse me of making remarks when I was younger, by which he meant that I would always kind of come out with the thing that everybody was thinking that no one quite said at kind of family lunch parties, to the point where he used to say to me before family lunches, "Don't make remarks." And I actually have made a career out of making remarks. I was a columnist, an interviewer, editorial director, editor of the magazine at the Sunday Times, and basically being a journalist is pointing out kind of what everybody's thinking and maybe nobody is saying. So yes, I think I was a born journalist. I think journalists are very nosy. They're interested in what's going on in other people's lives and in telling stories. And I was always interested in the stories that join people together and in reading the zeitgeist and seeing what was going to come next. So I think I probably couldn't have done anything else.
And looking back, what were some of the highlights?
Oh, I've done all sorts of things. I've interviewed everybody from Theresa May to David Cameron to Sheryl Sandberg to Charlton Heston to Gary Lineker over my career, Dalai Lama, all sorts of people. So it was incredible to get that kind of access. I've been to some incredible places, China, inside Facebook. Just the kind of access that you get is amazing as a journalist. And then I think also as an editor, there's that sense of being on the pulse, being in the room when decisions are made, being the person who is deciding what everybody else is going to read and therefore talk about for the next week. So there is a kind of very powerful kind of sense of hands-on levers, which I really loved.
And just looking back over you were obviously at Sunday Times for a really long time. Can you paint a picture of how it started off, how women started out in the newsroom then and how it is now? Has there been big changes?
I think in some ways there have been changes. In other ways, maybe not as many changes as you might hope. Except when I began, I was often the only woman in meetings, and people, I'd be in a meeting with 20 blokes and they would turn to me and go, what do women think? And that was quite a responsibility when you're like 25, 26. I think that there was a lot of very sexualized banter when I first began, and kind of, if you bent over to kind of pick something off the floor, they'd all be like, "Well, while you're down there, love," that was pretty common. And
accepted at that point, and at that point it was accepted, whereas now that sort of banter people can't necessarily get away with.
Back then, it was almost like a test to see if you were, a kind of shrinking violet or somebody who could handle themselves. I went to a boys' school for sixth form where there were 50 girls and about 800 boys, and then to Oxford, which again at that time was very male dominated. So I'd come up in a school where I was quite used to giving as good as I got when it came to blokish banter, and I think that definitely came in handy at the Sunday Times. But I think what was really exciting about that time was just this sense as a woman that you were being allowed in the room. It was still relatively rare for young women to be at the heart of decision making on a newspaper like the Sunday Times. And so there was something very, very heady in that. And I think that the fact that you were allowed in the room and that you were allowed to be part of it meant that you probably put up with behavior that you shouldn't have, because it felt kind of so exciting and so kind of groundbreaking almost to be there. I was running the news review section and some of the comment pages, and Focus, which was the big was doing the American election, or the Iraq War, or after 9/11, all the kind of outcomes of the terrorism. So to be running the coverage on such huge stories in my early 30s was very heady and exciting.
And you've obviously occupied senior roles for years. What have you learned about good leadership and being a good leader?
I think being a good leader is never asking someone to do something that you wouldn't do yourself or haven't done yourself. And really trying to take care of your people. I mean, I learned pretty early on that if you were nice to people and you went, they would always go the extra mile for them, for you. And so I used to promote people when they came back from maternity leave, because I knew, for instance, that it's really hard to come back when you leave your baby, and if you really feel like your job values you and is promoting you, then it's easier to kind of put that time in and feel committed to it. What other things? I just used to try to be nice to my people and to try and help them with the stories that they were doing. But I think I was also quite tough. I wanted good ideas. I wanted groundbreaking content. There was a lot of pressure to get scoops, to have stuff that other people didn't have, the story that everybody wanted to read that weekend. I was definitely pretty competitive. And I always wanted to win on that front, and that was definitely very much a part of the culture and of where I was, where I was. I think that my ideas around leadership and what leadership looks like has really changed in the 30 years that I've been doing it, and as I think it has in the world. I mean, certainly when newspapers are also like the last great empires. The editor really is the chief. It's a kind of real command and control economy. There's no flat hierarchies there. There's one person's view, and everybody else, when they say jump, you say, how high can I stop jumping yet? And so that was very much the kind of culture which we all grew up in. I'm glad to say I don't think it's quite that brutal now.
Yeah, and so how do you think that your leadership has evolved from the beginning to now?
These days, I mean, I run a team at Noon, and we're like a kind of bunch of mates, really. I think what I've really learned is you hire really good people and you let them get on with it. And if it's really bad, you say, oh no, not that mountain, but this mountain. But most of the time as a leader, you're saying, is it blue, is it yellow? And it doesn't really matter. So I think I've learned to kind of get out of people's way as a leader when it doesn't matter. And that really the point of leadership is to say when it's really going wrong and you need to go somewhere else, and to inspire people with a new vision. And I feel like what I do now is more thought leadership, is around a whole agenda around gendered ageism that I really care about. I mean, I really think as a society, we have to change the stories that we tell about the later parts of women's lives. And
so let's get into this now. So how did Noon come about, and what's its driving force?
So Noon is entirely a kind of founder, business and idea. So it really came out of my own experience. So I left the Sunday Times after 23 years, and I'd been there. It's very odd when you've been with a company for such a long time. So I think you become really institutionalized. And when I talk to people about it now, there's hardly anybody I know who has worked in a place for such a long time. But of course, when you have, and then you leave it, there's a huge sense of loss. It's a bit like a kind of weird kind of bereavement or something, and you lose that whole sense of identity. I've written about it as it feeling a bit like you're in Game of Thrones and you're one of those people with one of the really huge cloaks with all the gold on it, and they take the cloak off, and so you're suddenly like, wow, who am I without this huge cloak? But actually, it's actually really quite a good experience, because you realize when you take the cloak off that it was heavy, it was cumbersome, it endowed you with a whole thing which is not necessarily who you really are. And so for me, I felt a massive sense of kind of freedom. I now feel so much more myself, so much happier, so much healthier, so much less stressed, and also just much more in charge of my own destiny and able to explore the things that I really care about. So this moment when I came out of the Sunday Times was a huge thing, because suddenly I kind of looked around, and I was also interested. I was made redundant, and I've been quite open about that. And that was a real shock to the system, because I think if you've always been competitive and a winner and done really well, all of which I had, and the day that I was made redundant from the Sunday Times, it was my own interview with Sheryl Sandberg for International Women's Day on the cover of the magazine, which is a global exclusive about her engagement. So I wasn't being made redundant because I wasn't good at my job, and that was very, very hard for me to get my head around. And so I was quite open about talking about that kind of loss and that kind of expulsion from tribe and what that felt like. And that was also really the foundation for Noon, because I came out and I was Googling good old journalists. I was kind of going, oh, I need to find something to read about somebody who's been in this situation. What do you do when you've been super successful for 23 years and then you're suddenly out? How do I move into my next phase? Where's my next chapter? Where is something out there which are going to be like the pebbles in the wood for Hansel and Gretel, which will show me how to find my next path? And I couldn't find anything. So I've always believed in the Obama stuff about being the change you want to see in the world. So I set it up. I set up Noon, and that's all about empowering women in midlife to find a new chapter, to move on. And what I've discovered, the more I've dug into this, was that I was really onto something. That it wasn't just that there wasn't anything saying, what do you do if you've been made redundant? There was nothing really at all talking to women in midlife about our lives as they are now. We've had a bit of menopause stuff, but for me, this part of life is so much more than the menopause. I mean, the menopause it's like kind of talking to a teenage girl and saying and defining her entirely by the fact that she had periods, rather than thinking of all the other things, exciting things that are going on in their lives. So I think while I welcome the more information and discussion about menopause, I'm really resistant to the idea of us being branded as walking hot flushes. That feels to me very reductive. And if you think that feminism has always been about women escaping their biology, to therefore suddenly brand a whole generation of women as menopausal as their main characteristic, I think is really wrong. So Noon is all about helping women through the pinch points that hit at midlife, and helping them into a new chapter. And this for me really matters, because I want all women to look forward to being 50 as the time when they come into their prime, when they become the women they're supposed to be, where they really reap the rewards of all the hard work and achievement that they've put in up to that point. And I see that in so many women around me. What I'm doing now with Nina, where I feel really fulfilled, so many women doing fantastic things in their 50s, and yet the mainstream media doesn't want to talk about us at all, isn't interested in what we're doing. It's
really interesting. It's really interesting because I obviously worked in fashion before, and it was the same thing. You wouldn't sell to that demographic. You wanted to sell to the millennials, you wanted to sell to Gen Z because it seemed a little bit cooler, a little bit more hip. Whereas actually the people that were spending the money were actually those that were 45, 50 plus. But it was just not it didn't have that much glamour around it, unfortunately.
Well, hopefully that's changing. So the research that we've just done at Noon, which is where we're calling our women in midlife queenagers.
Which I love the name, by the way. Hashtag queenagers. Great.
Welcome to your queenage years. So, which I think is a really good rebrand about, this being a time when we come into our prime, where we have some money. I mean, to your point about fashion, women aged 45 to 60 spend 250% more than millennials or Gen Zs, which is unsurprising because we've got the money. And also, I think what's really interesting about our generation is that we are a new kind of midlifer. There've never been queenagers like us before. And it's there in the statistics. So in 2019, women over 40 earned more money than women under 40 for the first time ever. And that's because we've stayed in our careers and we've gone on working, rather than stopping when we had kids. And of course, nearly a third of university educated women of this age do not have children. It's a really huge statistics. And if we think around our friendship group, we know that we can see that that's true. But it's a really huge thing. So there's a massive cultural gap between what people think women's lives are like at this point and the reality, which is that so there's nearly a third of the university educated who don't have children. of whom nearly half have chosen not to have children. So therefore, the idea that we value women's lives by whether they have procreated or not is completely wrong if almost a third of the generation are not having kids. And so there are all these kinds of narratives around our lives and what we're supposed to be doing, which are now completely not fit for purpose. So that's what I mean when I talk about gendered ageism. Gendered ageism is where sexism meets ageism, and that is a huge thing in the world at the moment. More women over 50 have lost their jobs in the pandemic than any other cohort. And I have a theory about that it's when you become both physically less pleasing at work and also I think temperamentally less pleasing. You're a bit more like, I know what I'm doing. I've been doing this for a long time. I'm not going to just kind of, shut up and simper when some much more senior man says it's something which you actually know is wrong. So I think that kind of less pleasing thing is definitely behind why a lot of women at 50 get beaten out. And I think also our research shows that the women are much more interested in work-life balance. They're not interested in external metrics of success. So only 5% in our research valued kudos or kind of external success as a kind of benchmark of what they were doing. And 81% wanted to be in control of their own work-life balance.
And
so
those
I think that tension hits at this point when you become a senior leader.
Yeah, and those two bits of research I actually found really fascinating, because I was just wondering, what is it? So if only 5% recognize kudos or motivated by kudos, what is it that's really motivating them?
Well, I think control of their own life, so control over their own work-life balance, and then the feeling that they're really valued by their organization, and then third, that they're having impact, that they're appreciated, and that they feel that they're doing something useful. And if they don't feel either of those things, then they want out.
That makes sense. And that 81% being in control of work-life balance, for me, it really connects to well-being, which is obviously what we are very conscious of at Conscious Working. So I'd love to know what your audience thinks about well-being and how their audience views that and how they integrate it into their lives. Have you done any research around that?
Yeah, we really have. I mean, from a personal point of view, I can say that my current well-being is off the scale compared to when I was being an executive at the Sunday Times. One of the things that I've really learned in the 2 years since I left, actually, was just the importance of just slowing down a bit. I think that I lived in a world, and you've written about this really eloquently, Brett, on Noon and elsewhere. And I think it's really true that that when you're in one of those massive executive jobs, which you were too, and particularly when you've got kids as well and you're traveling, you're just constantly in a state of like kind of almost like running panic. I think would be a fair way to characterize it, that you're constantly living on your nerves, running on adrenaline. When I first left the Sunday Times, I just had this weird sense that I was a bit like an octopus, that I had like kind of 8 arms. I was so used to kind of juggling so many things all the time that I almost kind of didn't quite know what to do with myself. And I think what I've really learned in the last 2 years is to be a lot calmer, more purposeful. I meditate now, which is something that I never used to do. Meditate every morning, and I now feel quite weird if I don't. I swim. I swam actually yesterday in the ponds on Hampstead Heath. They were only 8.5 degrees, but there's something about the shock of that cold water which makes me feel really truly alive.
And also really good for your nervous system to jump into cold water, and very good to like clear out toxins, whether it's like negative energy or just any other toxins in your body. So good cold water swimming.
For me, it's like something kind of turns a switch on, that if I do it, I just have this incredible kind of connection with nature, because I swim outside and I'm with the ducks and I can see all the trees and things, and B, just this like a kind of like somebody's just flipped a switch, that I just suddenly feel more energetic, more purposeful, more just kind of more vital, but also more calm at the same time. It's just I feel better for it. And I walk a lot. I try and actually my health thing on my phone tells me that I do about 6,000-7,000 steps a day generally. So I try and do that. And actually, weirdly, without really consciously trying at all, I've lost about 2 stone since I left the Sunday Times. I feel really different, and I think the way I characterize it to myself is that it feels like I don't need that armor, that there was almost like a kind of like a fleshy barrier that I'd put up around myself to protect my kind of true nature from the kind of cut and thrust of the place, and that now I feel like I'm really able to live my own values and really speak my own truth, and I'm campaigning all the time about something that I really believe in and care about. I can be much more kind of more freely in the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And actually that it took me, because obviously I went through burnout and then I left fashion and had a big career transition, but it took me a long time to shed the corporate world.
Yeah.
And just how you were talking about like taking that cloak off, it was really heavy, but yeah. You're so used to that, and it's so ingrained in you, and it's so part of the identity for so long that, for me at least, it definitely took not just 1 month, it took a few months, maybe like a year, before I was like, oh wow, okay, it's not me. I am not my thoughts even. I'm not my thoughts. I am not my job in and of itself.
No, and it's such a weird thing, that, isn't it? I totally felt that. And I also feel now, looking back, that I had kind of lost myself in the job, that it was such a kind of weird thing, because when I was younger, I really loved it and I loved the excitement of it. And then I think you become a bit addicted to the kind of adrenaline rush, or the kind of, the kind of feeling important, or it just kind of becomes who you are in some way. But actually, of course, one changes. And I think particularly when you become a mother and other things in life kind of shift, and that there's just no space for any of that kind of, personal growth is not really a term that I would use, but I don't think there's any space for that when you're so busy and so on that treadmill. And particularly in journalism, you're really living kind of, on your wits and your kind of updates all the time. I mean, I have a lot of energy as a person anyway, but I think it was wearing me down in ways that I hadn't even really known. And I feel so much happier, so much more me, so much calmer, and so much more like I'm really living a more kind of conscious and purposeful life, that my kind of true kind of spirit and emotions and heart and kind of purpose are all aligned. Whereas I think in my old job, I was always a bit of a square peg in a round hole, even though I did it for a really long time, because I'm not particularly right wing, and I was working for quite a right wing newspaper, and I was a woman, and it was quite a kind of blokey culture. And I think you don't realize, as you say, till you take off the cloak, quite the burden that you've been carrying by doing it. And I think it's 2 years since I left the Sunday Times, almost exactly. And I remember when I left, another journalistic colleague who'd left the Telegraph in a slightly similar way about 10 years before, saying to me, it'll take 10 years till you feel like it'll take 2 years until you feel like it's normal. 10 years, that's a Freudian slip.
Hopefully not 10 years.
Hopefully not 10 years. Yeah, 2 years is fine. And also with the lockdown and everything as well. So she said it'll take 2 years until it kind of feels normal to be out. And I think that's right. It takes quite a long time for it to kind of process through your brain. You have strange dreams. It's kind of, I don't know, the adjustment is not easy, but I do really love being a founder and being in control of my own destiny. It definitely comes with its own roller coaster, as you know, but it definitely feels, I like the idea that what I'm creating can't be taken away from me, that it's mine. I mean, I feel like I created a lot of franchises that created a lot of value in my old role, which I think it was then quite hurtful when all that suddenly kind of all that stuff that you created suddenly isn't yours at all. And you kind of feel while you're there and part of the organization that it is. And then, of course, it isn't, because all your intellectual property is the property of the company. So I felt very determined this time. I think Noon is a really good idea, and it's mine, and that means a lot.
And you sort of ties back to that idea about having, you know, the motivator being purpose, and it's tied to your story, which is incredibly powerful. It's the same sort of reason we set up Conscious Working, to get well-being in the workplace, because of my own experience. And I think when, as an entrepreneur and as a founder, your story really does help drive the business forward.
Totally. But it's not easy, Brett, as you know, to share one's vulnerability. I mean, I was watching Brené Brown, who I love, and I do a lot of coaching now with quite senior women, media training, and more about helping people tell their own story. But I think that there's a massive power in vulnerability, particularly if you're quite a kind of powerful, successful person. But tapping into that and telling that story is hard. You know, you're kind of ripping off a few band-aids in the process. You know, it's painful. And I was really reminded of this. I was speaking to some women last week, and there was a lovely woman who came, and I was speaking about vulnerability being power and my own founder story and stuff. And she came up afterwards and she burst into tears, and she said, I lived in 27 different homes before I was 18, and she'd been homeless at one point, and she'd been on the street, and she was now a very powerful executive, and she'd never shared that story. And I said, but that's such a powerful story, you know, that's amazing. Somebody else who's in that situation, who knows that they can get from the street to being where you are, that's an amazing story. And she burst into tears, and she said, yeah, but there's so much shame that she felt kind of paralyzed by shame around what had happened to her, even though that she was now, you know, so successful. And there was a lovely Nigerian woman who'd come up with her, and she was also talking about the shame she felt about some of the racist incidents she'd encountered earlier in her career. And we were talking about, you know, and I was saying, yeah, but those stories, that vulnerability, you know, is your superpower.
I love that you're sharing that, because it's the number of comments I've had around me sharing my story, and just the same, like, thank you so much for sharing what you've gone through, because there's still stigmas around all these things, whether it's burnout, whether it's being made redundant, whether it's something much bigger that actually someone has no control of. But I guess, how can we help change that? I mean, you and I are obviously telling our stories, but how can we get those other women to tell their stories and to feel okay telling their stories?
Yeah, well, I think that's the trick, is the feeling okay telling them. And what I was going to say was that I did this workshop with these women. I gave a speech. I do quite a lot of speeches to kind of executive pipeline ladies and leadership and telling your story and all that stuff. And so I've been going, oh yes, vulnerability is power, da da da. And then that evening I gave a talk on, I was on the radio, and they introduced me as, this is Eleanor Mills. She was made redundant from her big job at the Sunday Times. And I really got that kind of, ooh, you know, ouch. I didn't want to be introduced to somebody who'd been sacked. You know, it was really horrible. So, and it really made me think about what I'd been saying to women earlier, because I'd been going, yeah, your vulnerability is your superpower. But it still hurts. You know, it was almost like the universe was reminding me not to get too kind of glib about that, and how really bad it is for it, you know, how hurtful it can be. Because I really felt it, and it was almost like going, yeah, it's all very well telling other people to, you know, kind of share their pain, that their vulnerability is their superpower, but it comes with a, you know, it's still hard. You know, there is a shame about it. I loved your story about burnout for that reason, because we're not kind of supposed to show the toll that it takes. But I was interested at the weekend, Helena Morrissey, who's the one who'd had 9 children, she's actually on our Noon board, and had been CEO of a big bank. She was one of those women like Nicola Horlick, who was always kind of held up as, you know, women can have it all, 9 children and a CEO job. And she came out with an article saying actually how hard it had been, how it really was a complete masquerade. Most of the time she was, you know, pretty well dying under the surface. And I think that the only way that we make all of this stuff better for our children and the next generation coming through, and that for me is a huge motivator, because as you know, I've got 2 daughters, 19 and 17, and I hope that a lot more of this is fixed and easier for women by the time they get to the point where they're going to be leaders, you know. And I'm jolly well hope that they are going to be leaders. That's what they've been trained to be. But I hope that they can be more honest about the toll that it takes, the pressures that women are under particularly. And also I think my whole narrative about changing story about the later parts of women's lives is so that women feel that they have a bit more time. I think that part of the reason that you burnt out or I felt under such pressure was that we're trying to cram so much into such kind of short decades of time, you know, kind of 20s, 30s, and actually saying to women, look, when you get to 50, you can have like a whole new next chapter. You can become a founder. You can write that book you've always wanted to. I've got a great story on Noon about a woman who became a lingerie model in her 50s, another one who became a stand-up comedian, or a woman who went back and trained as a doctor. You know, we have time in the 100-year life, which is, you know, what we're lucky enough, touch wood, to be looking at. 50 is only halfway through, so time is on our side. So I also think if we change the narrative around women's kind of sell-by dates, as it were, so that the men are always seen as fine wine, getting better with age, women are seen like peaches, one wrinkle and you're out. You know, if we can kill off that narrative, that will also make it a lot easier for the women coming up behind us. And I think if people like you and me are honest about the toll that putting yourself as a square peg in a round hole, being a kind of woman in a very macho world, you know, what that actually does to you as a person, and that maybe, you know, for all the success that it looks like you're enjoying on the outside, and I know you really felt this too, the price you pay is quite high, and actually there is a point where you can't do it anymore.
So true. And it does take more and more people in the support network for people to feel comfortable sharing. And the more we do it, and the more female leaders there are that are embracing that and showcasing it to their teams, I think that your daughters will experience a different, they'll have a different experience within their working world than what we did.
I mean, I really hope so. And I think that really, I mean, I'm all for the kind of conscious working and for companies taking all of this stuff more seriously. Where I worry a bit is I see some office cultures where they're like, okay, stay in your rabbit hole, work harder, work harder, work harder. Oh, here's 2 minutes of mindfulness. You know, we're looking after your mental health, and that doesn't work.
No, and we could have a like full-on conversation about that, because that's where it's like, okay, you want to do something to support, but it's not really authentic and genuine. Yeah. So you need to, for Noon and for In Her Space, you need to be offering something that feels relevant. Other businesses, they need to figure out what's relevant within their mission and values of their own specific business to offer their employees.
Yeah, and I do, what I do see is a shift going on. We've just, the big piece of research we've done into Queenagers, which is now the biggest study of women 45 to 60 that's been ever been done, actually. We've done with Accenture. And I wrote a piece for the FT last week, which was all about getting more women into senior management, and really looking at the things which hit women in midlife: divorce, bereavement, redundancy, elderly parents, teenage kids, your own health, bit of menopause, all those things. Often when I say that list, I can see women going tick, 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 tick. Yeah, you know.
But I would also think parents passing away, and the role, So those are all those pinch points that you notice. It's not just menopause. There's lots of other things that are impacting someone in their midlife.
Exactly. And menopause is often, you know, can be the straw that breaks the camel's back, but it's because of all those other things. We call it the midlife maelstrom. And I think that having a real understanding of that in the culture will help support women in corporate jobs and keep them in the management pipeline. Because I think on all of this, Gret, as we've touched on, we're very early in our journey of on the road to equality. You know, women got the vote 100 years ago. We're trying to overturn millennia of patriarchy and encrusted attitudes about what women should be. You know, it's in our culture all over the place. Just think about, you know, Shakespeare, her voice was ever soft and low, an excellent thing in a woman. You know, all those kind of things that women, all the stereotypes we're given of women are meant to be kind of seen and not heard. You know, that you should shut up, you should be pleasing. And we are a pioneering generation in pushing back against that. And we can see it now in our own lives and what we put up with when we were younger, which we wouldn't put up with now, and that our daughters are coming in a bit further along the curve. And this is a process. And actually, I think the best thing we can do is be really honest about the fact that equality is not a reality yet. We're on the way, but there's a hell of a lot more to do, and that we have to keep pushing. And also that misogyny doesn't disappear, it mutates, it comes back in different forms. I see it very much with my daughter's generation in a terrible internet pornography, in this kind of diet of violence against women that really young boys are now getting. And so we're saying to our daughters, oh, darling, you can do anything. And really, the boys are seeing them through a really violently sexualized lens, which is super unhelpful. It's another thing that I've been researching. So I just think we have to be really aware that we're involved in a revolution, and we need to keep pushing and keep talking and having these conversations, because this is all evolving. We're not there yet.
Yeah. So speaking of evolving, how is Noon evolving, and what are the next few months look like? Some highlights that are coming up for you.
Oh, well, I'm always super excited about our Noon reboot retreats, which we do in person at an incredible place in Yorkshire called Porton Hall. And they're really about deep transformation. And it's really helping women go through that kind of big shift that I've really been through myself in the last couple of years. And we work with some fantastic kind of therapists and counsellors, and a wonderful woman called Liz Dawes, who's was a solicitor. She's been this through herself. She was a city solicitor, and she left to study the Japanese practice of mindfulness in forest bathing. And she's amazing at that. So we really take the women out into nature. We swim up on the Yorkshire Dales. There's an incredible spa. We do quite a lot of constellations work. We really kind of dig into what the blockers are to the women, and what they're carrying, and what their personal sense of lack is about. And what we really see is that even women who seem very confident on the outside are carrying a huge burden of expectation, or not feeling like they live up to the standards that they were supposed to, or just a real kind of just this word lack, this kind of sense that they're not what they should be underneath. And so we find that we can really shift that. We do a lot of kind of burning stuff that we want to leave behind on the fire. Fantastic.
I love that. And if people
at the end of the weekend, it's completely different. And I've had so many of the women who come say that the retreat has completely changed their life. For me, it's my favorite week of the year. It's amazing. I'm knackered by the end of it, but that process of seeing people change, I think, is the most amazing thing that you can witness.
So if we have people that are interested in the reboot retreat, or just learning more about Noon, how can they find you?
So if you come to our website, we're noon.org.uk. There's lots of stuff about the retreat there. And we also run courses and events. We've got some of Brett's amazing meditations on the website. And we run, most of all, I mean, my background as a journalist, I ran the Sunday Times magazine. So we've got incredible first-person stories of transformation. When at the beginning of this chat, I was talking about I wanted the Hansel and Gretel pebbles out of the wood. So on Noon, you'll find loads of those. You know, Gret's story of her burnout and how she created her business, or my own founder story. But so many stories of women who have transformed and moved into a new chapter and created, kind of remade themselves and really found a purpose in absolutely rocking their midlife years, their queen age years, as we call them at Noon. And also, what we do is all about joy and optimism, and about really feeling in our prime, becoming the women we're supposed to be, being queen age, and enjoying that, and putting out that story to the women coming up behind us, that you don't disappear when you're 50. It's when you become who you're supposed to be. You're in your prime. Enjoy it, look forward to it. I want all the women coming up behind us to be planning their what they're going to do when they're queen ages, and looking forward to it.
Well, I am certainly planning my queen age years. I cannot wait for a 50th. Els, thank you so much for joining us today. You've offered such valuable insight into leadership, but especially around gendered ageism. I think a topic that we all need to be much more aware of and talking more about. So thank you for sharing everything with us.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me on, and well done for what you're doing. It's great.
Thanks, Els. Until next time, everyone, be here and be well. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you in the next episode. And by the way, if you like what you heard, then hit subscribe to receive all the future episodes. Better yet, if you're feeling inspired by what you just heard, then leave a review letting me know who else you might want to hear from on Conscious Leaders. To learn more about the show, about conscious working, or Tribe, our membership, head over to our website, consciousworking.co. Yes, it's just CO, so consciousworking.co. And for those of you that might be suffering burnout, we have a great free resource, the Beat Burnout Guide. It's a really simple assessment with tools for you to take action now. Check it out in the show notes so that you can access it immediately. See you in the next episode. Be here and be well.